Rabbi Jennifer Gorman, would you please begin our third MERCAZ Reads Israel book club meeting?
I'm happy to do so. So I'm very glad that everyone who could join us is here today. I want to just say Bruchim Habayim to all of you, and welcome to our third installment. That's been a long time in coming of MERCAZ Reads. I also want to just add, there are some thunderstorms passing through Toronto, in my area of Toronto, and if for some reason my modem goes out, I don't expect that it will, but if for some reason it does, I have the email set up on my cell phone, and I'll quickly log back in on my cell phone, and we will finish the session that way. Nothing will stop us this time around. So on behalf of MERCAZ USA and Mercaz-Canada, I just want to say thank you for hanging in there and participating when this has taken months to get to this book. My counterpart, Sarah Crane, in the United States, and I had planned a dialogue, but both fortunately and unfortunately, Sarah's in Israel on a solidarity mission that came up suddenly. And so I'm going to be running this session myself. And I hope that I answer all of your questions, bring up what you want to talk about, and that we have some time to then have an actual discussion. So All the Rivers is really a different type of book in many ways than what we had read before. It's not a memoir. It wasn't written as a memoir. But once you start researching it, once you start reading it, it turns out that it is actually quite autobiographical. And Dorit Rabinyan had a similar relationship. She dedicated this book to Hassan Hourani, and Mr. Hourani is a very successful, or was a very successful Palestinian artist, born in Hebron, studied fine art in Baghdad, went on to New York, where he did meet Ms. Rabinyan. Excuse me. After he returned home to Ramallah, he was able to visit the Mediterranean Sea to get past the checkpoints with his nephew and their girlfriends, and both he and his nephew drowned on that trip. So you can see there's very much a reality to her fictional novel. And I'm going to share a couple of links as we go through this. Ms. Rabinyan, in a interview with Time Magazine, and I'm going to share that link in case anyone wants to look it up later. Give me one moment, sorry, just juggling. She recounted a conversation with a friend when this book was about to be published. And the book came out January 1st, 2014. And she said to her friend, it's just a novel. And her friend said, you better be careful because there's a lot of controversy in this novel. And when Mr. Hourani died, before the novel was published, there was also a letter about a year after, so about towards his yurt site, there was a letter that, sorry, as I said, I'm trying to juggle too many things. You know what, I'm actually just going to put all of the links into the chat right now, and then I don't have to juggle as we go forward. Sorry about that. Give me one moment. And not opening. So I'm having some technical difficulties, but I have solved them. Just my Zoom was not opening back up to show me the chat. All right, so what I've put here is an interview, first an interview with Mrs. Rabinyan, who talking about the controversy that this book would engender, that she was warned about by a friend. The next link from The Guardian is a letter that she wrote to Mr. Hourani posthumously, expressing some of her feelings about their relationship and about the book. And then we have some marriage facts that I'm going to get to much further on in the thing. And I thought I sent it. to everyone, but perhaps I didn't. Nope, I sent to Sandy. I said it to everyone, and then Sandy, hi Sandy. Sandy had responded to me in my chat, reset. So let's do that one more time, because of course, not everything can be smooth and easy. So I'm very sorry about that, but here we go. And I promise, a promise I should never make, but going forward, here we'll be able to share all of these. And of course, now since Howie sent me a message, it went right to Howie instead of to everyone else. But we will figure this out. All right. So there we go. I hope that all the links are there now. And let me repeat that. So there is the Time Magazine interview with Ms. Rabinyan about this conversation before the book. She really never expected that this book would become a controversy in Israel. There is also the Guardian letter that she wrote to Mr. Harani, with whom she had a relationship. And then there's some marriage facts from Chidush, which I'm going to talk about as we move forward in this session. So going back and moving forward, no more problems. Sarah and I knew when we chose the book that there would be controversy. Unlike Ms. Rabinyan, we knew that as a conservative movement organization, choosing to read a book, an Israeli book about an interreligious relationship, that we would encounter controversy. I don't know that we realized just how much controversy we would encounter. And I can say I don't think Sarah did, but I actually received some, I won't go so far as to call it hate mail, but some extremely angry letters that we would even consider reading a novel from Israel that was banned by the Ministry of Education, that we would even consider a novel that dealt with a Jewish Muslim relationship. The the anger that came through was really very interesting, and actually I think says something about the book itself, because I think people are afraid that when we show any negativity, that when we move out of our comfort zone, that they are not just uncomfortable, but scared. Now, adding to some of the interesting things that come up with this book that we could not have done if we were doing this in January, now Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, now he's the Prime Minister, he was the Education Minister who put the book on a banned list. Additionally, Yitzhak Herzog, who is now President of Israel, stood with Ms. Rabinyan in support of her book as leader of the opposition in 2014. And that's another piece that's leading into this, because now, of course, Prime Minister Bennett and President Herzog are going to have to be working together in a different way. And as well, Prime Minister Bennett is in coalition in Israel with people who would have stood in support of Ms. Rabinyan back in 2014. So as soon as the book was banned, of course, it became a bestseller in Israel. And that's when translations began to be planned. I think that had then Education Minister Bennett not banned this book, I'm not sure it would have been available for us to read, although it did receive awards in Israel and has since received the Booker Award for the translation, the English translation. Now, when it came out, multiple authors, and authors that are pretty mainstream in Israel, A.B. Yehoshua, David Grossman, Amos Oz, came out in favor of Ms. Rabinyan and said, as soon as we are no longer willing to discuss issues, we destroy art. So there's some of the context in which this book was published. Additionally, right after the ban, and it came to the Ministry of Education's interest because a number of teachers had actually asked for the high school level that this book be put on the reading list, on the approved reading list. And of course, we know what happened with that. So shortly after that, by the summer, that was also the Gaza War. Now, during the 2014 Gaza War, this book was a bestseller. And if you start to read articles about the book, you'll discover that people were reading this book in their safe rooms. They were reading this book in bomb shelters and in stairwells. And actually, opposition leader then, Yitzhak Herzog, said publicly the decision to ban the book represented a backward worldview, and he bought several copies of the book. And he told students when he went to speak at pre-army academies, Mechina programs where he was visiting, that they should all read it. Because he felt that here is a book that gives us a different view of Palestinians, and a Palestinian who is interested in coexistence. So going on with that, and thank you, Becky. It does definitely not depict a relationship without difficulties, and in fact, I think those difficulties are really what's at the heart of the book. Many years ago, to throw in a personal note, many years ago, when I was, I think, in middle school, we called it junior high back then, my father said to me, at some point you need to decide what your priorities are. If you want to live a Jewish life, and that's important to you, then you need to marry someone who will also want to live a Jewish life. And I think I was just starting to date at the time, couldn't imagine dating someone who I would marry at that age. And he said, you never know when you will fall in love with someone. And there are wonderful people out there who do not have the same religious background, who maybe don't have the same worldview as you. If those things are important to you, and that's the life you want to create, then those are the people you need to date. And I think it was a very wise a wise move on my father's part. He didn't tell me. He didn't say, you can only do this. And we know in Israel, especially, when things are legislated, they don't succeed. Just because you can't take a bus on Shabbat does not mean that people are Shomer Shabbat. But Yom Kippur, where there's no legislation that you can't drive, the roads are empty. Right? Where there is freedom to choose how people will express their Judaism, there is more expression of that Judaism, and a range of expression of that Judaism, of course. So I want to spend just a couple more minutes on the banning of this, and then I want to dive into the meat of the text. So at the time, then Minister Bennett said that he was banning the book, and I keep glancing down. I'm gonna have it right here. I'm gonna move it away so it's not a visual distraction. He was banning the book because of a negative portrayal of Israeli soldiers. And I think it's particularly interesting because then, of course, now President Herzog said to many people who were in their preparation year doing pre-army academies, said, this is a book you have to read. And he said, when I look at that negative portrayal, does it paint Israeli soldiers as angels? No. But does it paint them as devils? Again, no. And the book itself is now known for being a very negative portrayal of Safon. I think when you talk about military, you have to realize that it's never going to be perfect. And I say that as someone who has a 30-year relationship to the US Navy. In fact, my husband is currently on a destroyer in the Pacific right now. He's a chaplain, spending his summer with the military. So no military is perfect. and the actions of soldiers, sailors, their actions too, some will be better, some will be worse. We know that the Israeli military is not always perfect. And when we insist that all portrayals must only be the Israeli military as the most moral military in the world, as which it has been described, when we only look at that, then we have an idealized view of a country. And I would imagine many on this call grew up, as I did, with this idea that Israel could do no wrong. And it was a beautiful image, but it wasn't a real image. And nowadays we're seeing comments from younger Jews around the world, but particularly in North America, but also Jews in Israel, who have real problems with this idea of giving an idealized vision. Because then when they do see a problem, when they do see something that is negative, something that is bad, something that should be created, it's as if Israel has toppled off a pedestal and has broken. And so we need to be able to view Israelis and Palestinians in a realistic manner. And as Diane wrote, these depictions can be used for sensitivity training. This is a depiction of Palestinians in a positive manner. Is it always perfectly positive? No, but neither is the other side. And I think that's what makes it real. And in many ways, I think that's what made this book threatening. This book gave us a space where Israelis and Jews in the diaspora overlap, and it gave us a space where Jews and Arabs, Jews and Palestinians overlap. And the author, in that letter that she wrote to The Guardian, wrote, "Your Arabness is more familiar to me than they," speaking about Jews in the diaspora, "will ever be. We come from the same neighborhood." And so, you know, if you see what's going on in this book, if you see what's going on, then we understand that in many ways, Liat and Hilmi have so much more in common than the people they see on the street every single day in their experiences in New York. Yes, and I'm gonna reiterate in case you're not looking at the chat, unfortunately, we don't have the author for this book. Ms. Rabinyan has done dozens and dozens of interviews on this book, and she's just not wholly available for continuing interviews. I know we did have authors for our first two books, and I expect that we will have authors for our next book, but the whole point of this is MERCAZ Reads Israel, and I will make sure that we have time for discussion, but it's that for us as Jews in the diaspora to read and experience through our own eyes what Israeli authors are saying, and not necessarily MERCAZ listens to Israeli authors, which is a different sort of program. So I thank you for coming, and I hope that you'll stick with us, even though we don't have the author today. So, but I think that that's what's really threatening to us. The idea that she as the author, and that Liat had more in common with the Palestinian, or at least felt that she had more in common with the Palestinian than she did with the other Jews that she met on a daily basis in New York. That's the only way, realizing that's the only way that we're going to move towards peace. And that's something that comes through, in my opinion, that comes through in this book, that Hilmi is looking towards coexistence. He thinks that if we could actually get to know each other, and this was an idea expressed by Mr. Harami, to whom the book is dedicated, if we could get to know each other really well, then we could have peace. And he was looking towards a bilateral, binational country where Jews and Palestinians would live together. For Jews, this becomes a problem because I think the majority is interested in those of us who want a two-state solution. That is still the majority of people interested in a two-state solution where we can live side by side and we can live together, but we're still interested in having a Jewish country. And on Thursday nights, I teach a class on Zionism for one of the congregations here in Canada, in Kingston, Ontario. And the majority of Zionists, and we're looking right now, we've been looking at the specific Zionist movements, the majority looked and said, we need to have our own country where we are in charge because we need to have someone who is a voice for Jews in the world. If we have a country that where Jews have a homeland, but it's not a Jewish nation, then we lose out on having that unique voice in the world to speak out for Jews. And it's not an easy thing. Israel, as a Jewish nation, is very young. It tries to balance the idea of being a Western nation and being at the same time a Middle Eastern nation. It tries to balance the idea of being a Jewish religious state with being a democracy. All of these things have not been done before. And therefore, this is an experiment in many ways in creating a whole new type of nation. One of the issues that will come up, and the reason I put that link to Chidush in the chat, it's the one that says marriage.chidush.org. One of the issues that comes up, of course, is how do we feel about a relationship between an Israeli Jew and a Palestinian Muslim? If you're living in North America, you can't help but know, if you're living in the diaspora, you can't help but be very aware of intermarriage. It is the price that we pay for no longer living in ghettos. Because the only way we can ensure that there will be no such thing as intermarriage is to only stay within a self-imposed ghetto or a ghetto imposed from the outside. Because as soon as we interact with other people, my father's words come back to me, and he said, yeah, there are wonderful people in all communities. And it's very easy to meet wonderful people, and it enriches our lives when we can be friends with different people. That's something that doesn't always happen. If you look at a map, a segregation map of North America, really of the United States, particularly of the US South, and then you look at communities, maps that show communities now and how integrated they are, you'll discover that those maps weren't so different. We still segregate, not legally, not on, not de jure, we don't keep people out of neighborhoods, but individuals tend to live where there are other individuals who are like them. From a Jewish perspective, it's easier for me to live in a Jewish neighborhood where I can walk to synagogue, where I can walk to the corner and there's a kosher pizza place, where I can do my shopping, where on Shabbat, people around me are not necessarily mowing their lawn because I can be outside enjoying my yard. But there's a price we pay, because when we do that, we don't interact with others, and you can end up with a one-sided view of what the others are or who the others are. And so whenever we create these intersections, whether it's through literature or in real life, it challenges our feelings, it challenges our comfort zone. And when we talk about Israel, it challenges what we think about Israel. Most people within the Jewish community, and we hear this from Israeli leadership as well, when certainly Jewish Israeli leadership, when they talk about Israelis, they really mean Jews. And this becomes a problem because when you talk about Israelis, you're not only talking about Jews. And it's important that we in the diaspora, but also our leadership, whether diaspora leadership or Israeli leadership, understand this. In Israel today, there is, because it is a Jewish country, because it is a religious country, and because of its history, it's still a young country, there is only religious marriage. It was one of the things that was agreed to with the Aguda at the formation of the state, that marriage would be in control of religious entities. The current coalition, which is Israel's only coalition that has ever included an Arab party. We've had Arab ministers before, but we haven't had an Arab party in the leading coalition. One of the things that they agreed to as part of the coalition deal was that civil marriage would be put forth in Israel. By the way, the Arab party is not in favor of this. They are not, the Arab parties often are placed on the left within the Israeli political spectrum, and they aren't. In many ways, there's a Jewish political spectrum that goes from right to left. There's a secular political spectrum that goes from right to left, and then there's the Arab political spectrum that pretty much is almost wholly on the right, and that has to do with religious issues. But one of the coalition agreements and what was agreed among all of the partners is that civil marriage would be put forward, because currently, and you can do more research on this if it interests you, there are over 650,000 Israelis who cannot legally marry in Israel. There are over 300,000. I think the number is close to, I think it was 336,000, but I know it's over 300,000 Jews from the former Soviet Union who are Jewish, but cannot prove their Jewishness, and so have no means to legally marry in Israel. Same-sex relationships cannot be legally done. So we have all of these issues which would change if secular marriage was allowed to occur in Israel. Now, if you do marry outside of Israel, you can come back and register your marriage, which means in no way does this limit change the fact that people do intermarry, and that's Jews with Christians, Jews with Muslims. There are same-sex relationships, marriages that are legal in Israel because the individuals got married every year. But all of these situations lead us to wonder, how do we interact? And I think the book, and Sandra, I see your question, and I'm gonna try and answer it in a minute. I see the book as an opportunity, and in the really hours of research in looking into this book, I think that it wasn't the ending that she was looking to strengthen the Palestinian-Israeli relationship, because really we no longer speak about the Arab-Israeli relationship. We speak about, particularly as you wrote, the Israeli-Palestinian relationship. The thing we have to get over isn't so much the ending, and I don't know that a different ending would have helped, but the thing we have to get over is a image that the Israelis are one particular thing, the Palestinians are one particular thing, and each side only views the other side negatively. And so the book itself, even if we don't look at the ending, if we can read the book without immediately throwing our arms up in fear, oh my God, this might encourage a relationship with which we will be uncomfortable, then we can take a chance to say, what is it about the Liat and Hilmi's relationship where when they were in New York and politics were not constantly in their face, they were able to coexist. But because their families and because their lives existed on this little strip of land in the Middle East, they always had this black cloud hanging over them, knowing that their relationship was doomed. And perhaps a different ending where they could work through their issues and work towards coexistence could help us strengthen the Israeli-Palestinian relationship, although I'm not sure that it would have made for a better book. I think the shock of the ending was important. I want to share one more personal experience, and then I want to open this up for hopefully an actual discussion. Hopefully we'll have some more questions. I'd like to hear from participants about what they feel, what they thought about the book, positively and negatively. More questions you have. So the book opens with Liat being questioned by FBI agents. Now, I'm currently living in Toronto, both a Canadian and an American. I grew up in the United States, and we don't ever like to think that our government is doing something wrong or something we feel isn't on the up and up, whether it's Canada, the US, Israel, wherever you are. And we don't like to believe that any of our nations, wherever we identify, would accuse someone wrongly. So I was in New York on September 11th, 2001. I had just returned from Camp Lejeune Marine Corps Base. So as I mentioned, I have a long-standing relationship with the US Navy. And about a month after 9/11, I returned to that base where we were living. I had a toddler and I had a baby and I was pregnant. And I often, with my kids in the car, definitely, but also for myself, I often listened to Hebrew music. And it was interesting because in the months following 9/11, and I couldn't help but experience some, I don't want to use the word flashback because it's much too strong a word, but a return of some of the feelings when I started reading about the FBI agents questioning Liat. In the months following 9/11, I could be out in town in Jacksonville, in North Carolina, and then returning to base. And every time I returned to base, because I often listened to Israeli music, and at that time, one of the things I was listening to a lot was the album Shalom Kaver, which was put together after the Rabin assassination, because it expressed a lot of my own feelings and being concerned about what was happening in the world. And I would worry as I would approach the gate, because every military base has a gate guard or guards. And as you drive up, you would turn off the radio as you drive up, but sometimes you would be waiting in a line. And every time I approached that gate, I would worry if the guard there would hear my Hebrew music, and would I somehow be singled out? Would the guard be able to differentiate between Hebrew and another language, Hebrew or Arabic? And even if the guard could, why would anyone who legally has a right to be on base be singled out for playing music or having a conversation in Hebrew or Arabic or whatever? Now, because I have a little bit of the defiant in me, I would deliberately not turn off my music. I would say, okay, this is ridiculous, and I have every right to be playing this music. I'm an American Jew. There's nothing wrong with me playing Hebrew music. I have every right to be on this base. I have my military ID. I have a sticker on my car that says this car lives, as it were, on this base. And I don't know if it ever made a difference. But what I do know is in that year, I was pulled over to have my car searched more frequently than I was in the years before. And we spent 4.5 years on active duty, or in the years since, once, in the year after, once a year or so had passed from 9/11. And it's a discomfort. It's an experience that has never fully left. And what the wonder of how are we all painted with a brush that comes from a bias. And of course, that's something that I think is very timely, not just here in this book with Israelis and Palestinians, but with anti-Semitism, with racism, with all sorts of issues that are going on in our world today. And I think that this book has a lot to tell us about our discomfort and about our comfort zones. A lot more than just the Israeli-Palestinian relationship, but actually a way of saying, if we can move past this discomfort and be willing to talk about things and to be willing to see things through the eyes of another person, we might be able to make our world a better place. And I think that's one of the issues that Ms. Rabinyan was trying to push through. Not challenging our comfort zones has not served us well. Israelis, I think, are a little better, at least in the general population, in pushing the envelope of their own personal comfort zones. But at the same time, I think they are not as good at looking at people outside their identifying group, right? One of the issues that was brought up in, I think, one of the many interviews was this book does not portray Palestinians in general as terrorists. And of course they're not. In general, people want to live and be well and live in peace. And we need to think about them in that sense. I think that's one of the messages that Ms. Rabinyan is trying to push forward. So if we're going to change the way we think about each other, that's the only way that we can achieve peace. We have to work together. We have to not do the same thing over and over again. We have to push forward. I'm happy to see that the coalition in Israel is doing that now. And I hope that the current government has a real chance to govern and to move forward. Now I want to open this up for questions or comments from other people, because as I said, this is MERCAZ Reads. This isn't just I read. This isn't just we hear from authors. This is all of us and how we feel about these books written by Israeli authors.
Rabbi, based on the number of people we have, what I'm going to suggest is, if for those individuals who would like to ask questions or comment in the chat box, that's great. I am going to, as we're speaking right now, I am going to allow people to unmute themselves and to start their videos. So we would just ask that if you want to make a comment, if you want to ask a question, not in the chat box, but actually by using your voice and showing us your face, if you choose to, just go ahead and unmute yourselves as you come on to ask your question, but then please mute yourself when you're done talking, so that we avoid background noise. So everybody should be able to unmute themselves one at a time and to open up their video, if you choose to do so.
So, I mean, I'm prepared to speak for another 20 minutes, but I think it would be lovely if we can hear from other participants. Okay, well, I will continue and
I just have one. Sorry.
okay. No, perfect. Go ahead, Bonnie. Is it Bonnie? You're muted again.
I thought I hit it. Okay, thanks. Not about the book, but something you just said, which is my line. I say all the time, we have to do something different. Otherwise, we're just going to keep getting the same results. And yeah, it's a way of looking at things that you have to just keep changing if it's not working. And we haven't. And I hope the new government will do that as well. Be pragmatic. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that, Bonnie. So I will say that many years ago, David Ben-Gurion said, to be a realist in Israel, you have to believe in miracles. And, I think that Israel is a miraculous place. We're reading this, we don't, obviously anyone is invited to participate in our book clubs, but as a MERCAZ event, we're reading this as conservative Jews through the lens of being conservative Jews. When we say Birkat HaMazon, one of the Harachamans, one of the additional pieces we add, we say that Israel's Reshit Tzmichat Gulatenu, that Israel is the beginning of God's final redemption for us. And that the redemption, this is the idea of religious Zionists who are so often considered, if you say you're a religious Zionist, people just assume you're Orthodox. But of course, religious Zionism is the ideal of conservative Judaism as well. The idea that in order to bring about redemption, in order to be a Zionist, we are in Israel, the land where our ancestors formed Israel, became the people Israel. We're there where Abraham and Sarah and all of their descendants, were able to be there, where our people returned. The stories of the Torah are not insignificant. They are our foundational story. And that brings us to this strip of land. But also, we take with us, as conservative Jews, the lessons that we get from Midrash, from Nachshon, where, when the Israelites are coming out of Egypt and they're on the banks of the sea, they're standing there, and of course the Egyptian army is at their backs. And Nachshon, Midrash tells us, goes into the sea, and he keeps wading into the sea until the water is about here. And he can no longer stand, he can no longer breathe, and only then does the sea split. And the message there is, Ein somchim al hanes, don't depend on the miracle to make things happen. We have to make them happen ourselves. And so Israel, modern Israel, while not being perfect, while not being a messianic image of what we hope the future can someday be, is still something that we have to work towards. And if we're going to bring peace, we have to continue to work towards it, not just work against it, not just circle the wagons and protect ourselves. And so changes have to be made. And in speaking with family and friends in Israel, and fully admitting that, of course, the family and friends to whom I speak, it's a self-selecting group. But that's the message I'm hearing from them. Changes have to happen because we can't continue in the way we are.
Can we take some lessons from the book, that their relationship worked in New York because they visited friends of each other's and socially interacted with them and got to know them, which allowed that relationship to be more stable, because as they got to know each other's friends, families, you recognize they're not, they're people just like we are people. Can we take that lesson away from that book this way?
Yes, I think, Sandra, we really, really can. And I think there are certainly we can in the diaspora, but also within Israel, there are people who are doing that. If you know anything about the Israeli education system, it is, you can choose to send your kids to religious school or not, or secular school. If it's a religious school, you know, pick your religion, right? They can go to a Muslim school, they can go to Jewish school, they can go to a Christian school. But then, of course, within the Jewish world, we're talking about not just Orthodox, but ultra-Orthodox. There is the Tali system. A lot of secular, so-called secular schools now have the Tali program, which is a religious Jewish enrichment program, but you're still focused on one group. More and more, we're seeing coexistence schools, Yad B'Yad schools, opening up in Israel. And I had the benefit of speaking with an architect who was trained in city planning, and she was telling me, not just me, to our group, that when you study architecture and city planning in Israel, that neighborhoods are built by who they think is going to live there. So it's not like in North America where someone builds a subdivision and they say, okay, I'm gonna, what do these houses need? Is this a more suburban community where there's backyards and sidewalks? Is this more an urban community? There's more rural community? No, and in fact, the communities are built with the ideas of the needs of the community, but based on cultural background. So will this be an Arab community? Will this be a secular mixed community? Will this be a secular Jewish community? Will this be a religious, and by they say religious again, I mean Orthodox Jewish community? Because if it's going to be an Orthodox Jewish community, well, more shtibel-like synagogues with a major synagogue, definitely space for mikvah, more apartments, less green space, which I just think is a shame. If it's an Arab community, there are areas of gathering because people want to be able to gather and share meals around Ramadan. And so there's more courtyards. And then the secular communities, they have their own issues too, more green space. And I can't help but wonder if we could take a lesson from this and say, how do we combine the best of all of these designs and say, why can't we have a community where there is a courtyard so that people can break fast on Ramadan together, but they can also be dancing there on Simchat Torah. And there is a mikveh, because not only the ultra-Orthodox need a mikveh, right? There are plenty of Jews and other movements who also use mikvahot, and they often can't find a mikveh in their own community because the communities weren't conceived of this in this manner. And so not only for Jewish Palestinian or Israeli Palestinian or Israeli Muslim, Jewish Christian, all of these, pick your combinations, right? Not just for all of that, but even for Jewish interaction, which has its own problems in Israel. If we could get to know each other, there are programs now to try and integrate the Haredim into the workforce, training and getting them to university so that they can also integrate and understand that all of Israel isn't like them. Ellen, did you have a question?
I had a comment.
Yeah.
What you were just saying is one of the incredible beauties, and for those who are of closed mind, the great dangers of fiction. When we have a fiction story, we are then able to identify with different characters and see the world through their eyes for a moment. And it is rare that in the real world, we have as many of the same opportunities. Many years ago, when there was Partnership 2000, okay, tells you approximately how old I am, and there's at least one person on here who knows really how old I am. We had someone staying with us, and we brought him to our conservative synagogue, where he saw almost everyone able to read successfully out of the Siddur, and women reading Torah, and this was a revelation to him, because it was the first, he'd heard that maybe there were such things, but he had never seen it. And that is what fiction can do in terms of starting to open people's eyes, because we don't always, I was lucky to have that experience. He was lucky to have that experience, but everyone doesn't get it. But that's one of the powers of fiction, because we can identify with the person who may look like us, and we can identify with the other.
So, right, absolutely. And it's why why Sari and I thought that reading All the Rivers would be an important book, because we don't want to just read books from people who are like us. We want to read books that will challenge us to look through the eyes of someone else, that will challenge us to think about Israel differently from the way we always thought about Israel. And we need more of that in real life. We need more Yad B'Yad schools where you have the opportunity, where children have the opportunity at a young age, but also it draws in the parents, right? And it draws in the grandparents and the extended family to experience what someone else does, right? To understand why some people wear a kippah and some people wear a hijab and some people wear a turban, and to share that at an age when it isn't threatening somehow, because they're just children, and to understand that different people do different things, and it's a better time. If you don't have that experience as a younger person, it's often hard to have that experience once you reach adulthood. Now, Diane asked about how everyone feels about the ending. I will tell you, I tend to read the end of books first. Total confession. I absolutely, in the only once in my life that I can really remember, did I not read the end of the book first, and that was not an easy decision for me. So I did read the book. I read the end, but of course then I didn't know what was going on. So I had to figure out what had happened and how we got to that. The ending shocked me. It was terribly sad, and it makes you wonder what could have happened. I'm not sure. There are two things to this, two pieces to this. One, the book, as I said, is dedicated to Hassan Harami, who also did drown. He met a similar end. And so it's part of that autobiographical piece to this book. So I think that for the author, the conversations for herself were cut off by the loss of her friend. So it seems like a very simple solution. Well, I'll just go with this because I don't know where to go with it, except it was the real thing that happened to her. And I don't know that what she could have gone with in such a way that we all would have looked at an ending and found that it's real. We have 5 minutes left, and so we can continue this conversation a little bit, but this leads us to our next book. Our next book is going to be Hope Valley by Chaviva Ner David. Now, it's the story of two women, one Jewish, an Israeli, and one a Palestinian Israeli, who form a friendship. And Ms. Ner David, in this case, is a member of Kibbutz Hanaton, the conservative kibbutz in the north of Israel, and a kibbutz that's involved in coexistence programs. So you have a you have a different view of what's going on. And thank you, Sandy. Yes, it really is a wonderful book, in my opinion. I do believe the author will be joining us. We're hoping she'll speak a little bit about the coexistence and how she came to write this. But maybe that book is sort of the next piece in the solution, right? That piece in how do we interact and how do we move forward, and also deals with artists. So maybe it's the story that couldn't have happened here because of what happened to Ms. Rabinyan and Mr. Harami, but what could happen if someone didn't drown, if he had survived. And so we'll be heading towards that. We'll be meeting, and we will not change it. We're gonna come hell or high water. We are going to meet on October 21st. Information will be going out about that, to talk about Hope Valley. And I think after reading this, it's really that next step in what could a solution be? How can we move forward? How can we look towards the future? I also want to say to all of you, if you have an author, an Israeli author who you recommend that we read, we are looking for novels. We're not looking for nonfiction. As I said, we did do a few memoirs, but we'd like to get more into novels at this point that talk about situations in Israel that maybe we can move forward and see things through different people's eyes. These characters, as I think Ellen had said, being able to see through someone's eyes in a book, which is perhaps less threatening to us. Are there any other questions that we have or comments before we close up? Then I'll have just a few last announcements. Okay. So I also want to let you all know that beyond MERCAZ Reads Israel, we are working, MERCAZ USA and Mercaz-Canada are working together on a full programming calendar. As I mentioned, October 21st, we'll also have dates of February 3rd and May 24th. We're not going to be doing this. I'm trying to reach out. We're going to put the dates on the calendar so they're more set in stone. And aside from our books, we're also going to be having 2 movies. There are movies, short movies, so you can watch them and then discuss them. They're put out by the World Zionist Organization, and we're going to be dealing with 2 of those. One deals with the issue of racism. One deals with the issue of Israelis, of Jewish Israelis coming from different walks of life within the same family. And we're going to be moving forward with that. We're also hoping to have a lecture series. All of these things will be starting right after the Chagim are over, right after Sukkot. I believe MERCAZ Reads Israel on the 21st of October will be our first. We will also have our holiday celebrations for Tu B'Shvat and Yom HaAtzmaut. This year, the conservative movement is working together to create a year of study. And all of the organizations are working together on this. Our theme is sustainability. MERCAZ will be participating by creating a Tu B'Shvat Seder. Our last Tu B'Shvat Seder was very well attended, and we hope that this new one that's going to be focused on this theme will be, and as well Yom HaAtzmaut. And I just want to share that on Saturday night, which is Tisha B'Av, Camper Ma in Nyack, their staff will be live streaming their Eicha reading to the Rabbinical Assembly's YouTube account. And if you're interested in that, if you look up the Rabbinical Assembly on YouTube, you'll be able to find that. It'll be at 9:45 Eastern time, but it'll also be available. So if you're on Western time or anywhere in between, that you can click on the link and play it back later. And thank you for the suggestion of Waking Lions. I will definitely be looking into that. It's only by a fluke that we have ended with a lot of female writers, and we would like to get a real spectrum of Israeli writers. And so we're interested in male writers as well, but also we're happy to look at writers who aren't necessarily Jewish. Again, where this is MERCAZ Reads Israel, and Israel has a whole host of people. So we're happy to hear from all sorts of authors. So again, on behalf of MERCAZ Canada, MERCAZ USA, MERCAZ UK, and the Israel Forever Foundation, who helped us start this, I'm so glad that everyone could attend. And I hope that I will see all of you on October 21st and in our programming going forward. So please watch your email and our Facebook page for more information. And with that, I wish you all a meaningful fast this Saturday night. I know it's still a little early, and lots of wonderful dairy during the 9 days we're a part of. Thank you.